I'm going to start on the debt side of things on page 14 of your booklets with a graph that we've used any number of times, and those of you who've been coming to these seminars for well more than a decade know we've been probably summarizing the debt picture with this graph more than any other. I think it probably does the best comprehensive job of showing the debt picture. We made the comment referring to this graph as an example of excessive debt back in the late 1990s, and then pointed also to absurdly exploded levels of derivative use, and then historically excessive levels of stock valuations as setting the tone for what would probably be a very difficult period to follow that. And in fact, that's what has happened. I just saw something in the last week or so that it's funny, I hadn't really concentrated on before, but with about 8 weeks left to go in this decade, if we count the 2000 to 09 period as the decade, this is fated to be the worst stock market decade in history, worse than the 1930s, unless we have just an extraordinary last 8 weeks of this calendar year. So it really has been a very difficult period of time. For those who have not seen this graph before, and those who've seen it, let me just refresh your memories on it. It is a ratio. We're looking at the total amount of credit market debt, which is essentially all the debt, public debt in this country, publicly held debt in this country, in a ratio with the size of the economy. So the denominator is the gross domestic product. And so when you think about that, it's logical that debt grows over time, population is growing, but if debt as a portion of the economy were to grow in sync one with the other, the line on this graph would be a straight line across the middle of the graph, or across the graph somewhere. In fact, it's obvious that it is nothing of the kind. We see, with the exception of this, we'll talk about in a second, you have a fairly extended period here with a range which isn't too dramatically different. And in fact, I just saw some data, excuse me, I just saw some data in this past week or two which showed that if you carried this back all the way to about 1875, you would stay within that broad range, there to there. And this didn't really break it out of the range because of an extreme of debt. As I've pointed out in time past, that was because in the Depression, the denominator of the equation, the gross domestic product, simply collapsed. So the ratio went sky high. But what we saw starting about 1980 was something absolutely unprecedented, an explosion of debt. We really became debt junkies. And so that's what has led us to where we are today, for good or ill, and we'll take a look at some of the components of that as we go. Now, I'm going to use a number of graphs here today, and I'm going to try, some of them I'll go through fairly quickly. I'll try to direct your attention to the most relevant portion of the graph so that I'm not just throwing a lot of numbers and pictures at you, but hopefully you can get a piece of information from each of the graphs. Many of the graphs that we'll use here, as I frequently do in these seminars, many of the graphs are from the Ned Davis Research Corporation, which is really a treasure trove of information. It's not cheap for individuals, but it's one of those great sources for institutional firms to employ. If you look over to the next page, you'll see the components of the debt. Here we look at the three major components: the household, business, and the government portion of debt. And these, what we're looking at here, are changes in the debt components. The top portion of the graph shows the household, and you'll notice that the line has dipped down very dramatically here from the normal area. Now you'll notice that the normal area is not zero. Zero is down here. So we have just really, for the first time in the time frame covered here, which goes back to 1953, we've dipped below zero. In other words, we are actually decreasing the amount of debt being held by households. Now, not all of this is going away willingly. This includes foreclosures. Of course, as homes are foreclosed, that debt disappears. So that really accounts for a good bit of the decline that we're seeing in household debt. Now, we see the same general picture in the business debt area with a fairly sharp decrease recently. That is still above zero, however, so it's still growing, albeit at a lesser rate. On the bottom, where we see government debt, that's where we see the real explosive additions to the debt figures. It more than makes up for the slowing in the other two components. What I want to do now is look at each of the components separately, and the first of those on page 16 is the household debt. And you can see, of course, the pattern is obvious. And this, again, is a ratio. So it says this is not just absolute growth in debt. This is growth relative to the size of the economy. So it means we have become more addicted to debt over time, with mostly with a few brief interims where we don't increase much. Most of the time we're going upward here. Now, we've had just that little bit of a dip down here, but you can see how small that is in the grand scheme of things after we've been rising for several decades. And again, much of that decrease is from not from the debt being paid off, but rather written off because of the massive number of foreclosures. Page 17 shows you the corporate debt picture. Despite frequent comments about corporate finances improving, it's clear that corporate debt continues to climb as a percentage of the economy, albeit not at quite the same rate as the household debt was climbing. But it is, and I just urge you to look at the top half here because it has the relevant information. It's clearly, though, ascending as a percentage of gross domestic product. Page 18 shows, in fact, that corporations have been replacing equity with debt for the last quarter of a century. And I think this probably surprises a lot of people. It didn't surprise me to learn that fact. It surprised me to learn the extent to which debt had replaced equity over that period of time. The top half shows the cumulative growth of corporate debt. I mean, these are the annual, these are the quarterly figures. Let me see if I'm right on that. Yeah, these are the quarterly figures, each one of these. This is the cumulative increase in corporate debt. And then down here, this is the cumulative decrease in corporate equity. And when you look along here, you do see the last observation here, but you don't see many quarters in which there has been an increase in equity. So increased leverage obviously increases the danger to a corporation in weak economic times. And a combination of bad business conditions and this big increase in corporate leverage has led to a surge in business bankruptcies that you can see over on page 19. This, by the way, this discontinuity here, this is when they changed the laws related to bankruptcies, and so you had that hurry-up effect. Anybody or business or personal where they were thinking of bankruptcy, they got it in before the law changed. Then you'll see that things started back up again, and you'll notice that this business down here, this is the business section. This surge has been growing very aggressively, and these are measured in thousands, by the way, as you see up in here. Page 20 shows where the massive growth in debt comes from, and that's government. This is where things, as Susan had shown earlier in a number of her graphs, this is really where the debt has most recently exploded. Recent borrowing has brought government debt to more than 100% of gross domestic product. And the relevance of that is that when monetary economists evaluate sovereign debt holders, debt issuers, various countries, 100% of GDP is roughly the area